She was funny, she was unassuming, she cared in the best possible way about how she looked, how she was with others. She was selfless, and one of the last things that she actually was able to say to me was, I asked her in hospital at end of life stage, do you need anything? How are you? Was her response, and that sums it up.
Leanne's precious memories of her wife Jill, who died of cancer last year, aged just 44.
2019 became our summer of making memories, and we did some amazing things. And something that will always make me smile is the fact that we got to be on centre court, Williams and Murray for doubles, and that was just one of her life goals ticked off, and it was a privilege for me to be able to spend that year, and devastating at the same time.
Jill had been given the all clear from cancer a few years before, but sadly it came back in a very aggressive form.
She was put onto medication straight away, which we knew would prolong her life. She came home and we had to have a lot of very difficult conversations, and one of those conversations included the fact that she wanted to go to Dignitas. Straight off, she just wanted to go.
Jill made the decision to see how treatment went, but the illness progressed quickly.
When it comes to that final end, particularly in an illness like this, there's not as much power, is there?
Absolutely not. And I want to be going out for lunch, I don't want to be going and choosing a plot at the cemetery. But we did all of that because Jill very much wanted to take control of what was happening to our lives. The one thing that I think is the most important final decision, and I know that was her belief too, she couldn't do. So she wanted to get as much control of every other element as she could.
And Jill was just 44 when she died. It sounds like the last few weeks of her life were incredibly difficult.
She had just under 10 days at end of life stage. I probably had a bit of a naive expectation of what end of life would look like. She was in pain. Again, the care she received allowed that to be dealt with, but she was crying out in pain. She was uncomfortable. She couldn't go to the toilet. She literally didn't move for days on end. And I know in my heart of hearts, and because she told me, that those stages, those days, she would not have wanted either herself or her family to have to endure.
While Jill was in her final months, Leanne's sister was also diagnosed with terminal cancer.
I was told, we can treat you, but we can't cure you. And that was a punch in the guts.
But of course, there's one fundamental difference compared with what Jill and Leanne were going through back here, that there is legislation now for assisted dying where you live in Australia.
I remember this coming in and just thinking with a bit of a pang of guilt almost. Oh, well, I'm here and I have this option, and Jill's at home facing this and doesn't have this option. What we know about my illness, that we know it's a one-way road. It's not necessarily going to be a very pretty experience towards the end. At this stage, I believe I would like to give myself that option.
Hearing that from Victoria, knowing that she has that choice, does that bring you any comfort, Leanne?
I think the key word you've touched on there is comfort. For me, it's really important, and a massive comfort to know that Victoria has that option.
What year do you think that was?
In 1985.
You've got the same freckly arms, so
yeah,
exactly the same.
These sisters are also united in grief. Zoe, Victoria and Sarah lost their mum Heather to cancer last year.
We weren't prepared for how quickly my mum would go downhill, and we certainly were never told that this is the horrors that can happen to a human body when someone is very ill. She didn't even resemble the woman who started this journey 10 weeks previous. It was absolutely horrific.
It was, she basically vomited up her tumour over her last 12, 14 hours. Even if she had been in the hospice, they wouldn't have been able to stop that happening. That is what happens to people with esophagus cancer at the end of their life.
Seeing someone you loved as much as you loved your mum in that fear must have been heartbreaking.
The hospice staff gave her as much medication as they could actually give her. and it just wasn't enough.
Our mum was begging us to end her life, and we are left haunted and we're left traumatised. The last moments of our mum's life or the last days of my mum's life was so difficult.
It's not only the experience that haunts them, it's knowing they couldn't help their mum die peacefully.
She would have wanted to end her life on her terms. Definitely, she would never have wanted us to go through what we did, or her, for herself, to go through that.
We have choice all through our life. Do you know? We choose when to get married, we choose when to have kids, we choose where to live. And that choice, when it's so important at the very end, is taken away.
That last choice.
That last choice. And that's all we're saying. We need people to have choice at the end of their life.
There's basically nothing much that they can give me. I know I'm going to die. I just don't want it to be painful.
Kay worked as a palliative care nurse for years. She suffers from a number of illnesses, including lupus, which attacks the immune system and makes her vulnerable to life-threatening conditions.
I have daughters, I have my husband, I have my grandchildren. I don't want to watch them watch me suffer. It's a personal choice, but in choosing it, it gives you peace of mind and it allows you to live the best life you can until that moment arrives. And that to me is priceless. I could have quality time with my family and be able to say my goodbyes.
What would you say to opponents? You know, a lot of them are arguing that this could be abused.
There's very few people going to change their mind when they're in agony. I think the safeguards that they've put in place in other countries and that they intend to put in place here are so strong that I doubt very much if it can be abused.
Can you picture yourself, your reaction, if the law does go through this time?
I'll be in tears because I have seen so many people die and I have seen such agony, even my own mother. And to finally know that if you make that choice, that doesn't have to happen. As a nurse and as a person in my situation, that will be sheer and utter relief.
Legislation on assisted dying has already failed twice at Holyrood. Another draft proposal is now being consulted on. Only terminally ill people who have full mental capacity would be able to seek assistance to end their lives. 2 doctors would need to confirm their diagnosis and assess that they are making the decision without being pressurised. But these safeguards are not enough for those on the other side of the debate.
Our principal concerns are for vulnerable members of society, particularly those who are disabled, those who are terminally ill, those who are depressed.
Gillian Wright is a former palliative care doctor who is now part of Our Duty of Care, an organisation made up of healthcare workers opposed to assisted dying.
It's a huge thing for doctors to change from preserving life to taking life, and that's the kind of fundamental objection that we have. We as doctors don't want to participate in the taking of life. We felt that it was really important that there was a clear medical voice of opposition.
They've written a letter to the Health Secretary raising concerns.
Rather than say to people when you're giving them a terminal diagnosis that the state would help them take their own life, we should as a society be backing really excellent palliative care research. It is important to recognise that not all pain is physical, and so there needs to be psychological support, social support, and that's why generally the palliative care model involves not just doctors but nurses, social workers, psychologists, and that whole provision of palliative care needs to be a real priority, I think, for Scotland.
Gillian's concerned that any change in the law would be open to abuse or that legislation could be extended in the future.
If you look perhaps at an example such as Canada, they introduced legislation for terminally ill, mentally competent adults. But already within 5 years, it has been challenged in the courts for being discriminatory. So for establishing that there would be a right to die that would be limited only to one group of patients. And so because of that, the legislation has now been extended. So to not only those patients who are terminally ill, but to those who have a chronic disability. And actually it has been extended extended even further to those who have a mental illness.
You've talked about some of the concerns you have about legislation around the world, but I'm sure some would argue there is robust paperwork. Is that not enough?
I think it would be very difficult to safeguard. I think the current law is the safeguard, and the current law is the protection for the vulnerable. I think I would have never imagined that it would be extended to children, and it has been both in the Netherlands and in Belgium.
We've heard harrowing stories from loved ones who've seen their relatives go through horrendous deaths in lots of pain, drawn out process. We've also heard from someone who is keen to end her life on her own terms. What would you say to them?
Your heart goes out to families who've had really difficult times. So my background was palliative medicine, and we did look after patients who had difficult symptoms at times. And I think there needs to be a real hard think about our provision of palliative care, both in the community, in hospice and in hospital, and say we cannot stand for this. And patients who are having difficult experiences, families who are distressed, that they need to have a better deal.
But for some families, improved palliative care isn't enough, and giving people the choice of assisted dying is the most humane option.
We understand that people think that it's going to be abused. Well, that's no good enough reason to let our loved ones suffer.
I don't think anyone could oppose this bill or this change if they had even spent
One day.
an hour in our shoes.
Maybe the assisted dying bill will give people the option of a better final end-of-life stage. And for me, this is all part of Jill's legacy. And I will never stop saying her name, but I hope I can soon say it to say that her story contributed to the Assisted Dying Bill Scotland being implemented.